Okay, now we move to the Americas. As I'll go into in a second when I segue over to the map. Now we're in a huge chunk of property, especially if you think about it compared to when we started the semester when we were looking at Europe. We're now in an entirely different sort of size focus compared to that whole scenario. So we're actually talking about two continents, and of course the sort of land bridge between them. And the key thing is when we look at this is one, understanding the complexity of the Americas, which we don't really do, and it's rather embarrassing that here in the United States we really have almost no awareness of the rest of the two continents that we're part of. We probably know more about Europe than we do about South America, or say most of the Central America, the Caribbean region, which is pretty surreal. So let's go take a look at that. We'll switch over and do this from there. Sorry about that. It's never particularly clear whether it actually did switch or not. So here we see the Americas. What we're going to look at in this chunk is basically the southern part of Mexico all the way to Tierra del Fuego in the south. So we're going to sort of set it up here. And we just sort of look at this in context, and you consider this area here compared to when we started and we looked at Europe, it just disappears in this area. A lot of European countries are smaller than some American states, and in fact, there's some American counties that are larger than some European countries. So it's just an entirely different pattern of scale. And you have to remember, it's sort of distorted because of the way maps are projected. These land areas aren't accurate. For example, this area up here isn't as large as it looks, and this area here is actually smaller than it looks. So one of the distortions of when you try to put a three-dimensional sphere on a two-dimensional flat plane. So anyways, the Caribbean and Latin America. Not to segue over here, it's sort of hard if you, on one hand, it's easy to see countries with this one, but you don't really understand the dynamics of place as well as you do when we switch over here. So if you look at this, what you can see a little more clearly is that the Americas are actually in large part, their modern configuration we see now is in large part defined by, again, these continental plates, and specifically this area here, where the North American, South American plates have rammed against the North and South Pacific plates. So here's your Pacific plates, and we're right in smack dab in the middle of the North Pacific plate here. Here's one of two South Pacific plates. The South Pacific plate ends here. You can actually see where it wangs into what's left of here's the Austronesian or Australian plate here, the Eurasian plate here. So if you look at this dark line here, what you're actually seeing is the different plate boundaries. In other words, these different periods of different areas of hard rock matter that are sliding across the sort of viscous surface that actually is the planet Earth. And so what you have here is the Americas here are both sliding to the west, and they're basically doing like a giant train wreck or a ran car collision with these slower moving plates in the Pacific. And what these means is these American plates are moving west and they're hitting these, is you get this enormous buckling effect as this material crashes into this slower moving piece here and sort of stacks up on it. And so one of the huge side effects of this is you end up with these massive mountain ranges that go all the way from the northern part of Alaska here. You notice they come down here, there's two parallel patterns. This becomes the Rockies, to a lesser extent the Cascades, Sierra Nevadas here, down into Mexico, continue down here, sort of fizz out a little bit with land bridge, but then they're actually still going on here. They're still, if you notice here, they're still somewhat underwater, and they pop back up, and this becomes the Andes Mountains in South America, which goes all the way right down to the bottom and ends up down here, and eventually you can actually see here, where there was sometime in the past was part of this whole sort of Pangea thing that of course is Antarctica. So when you look at the Americas, the huge defining feature of the Americas, and one of the most important features on these two continents, is the enormous mountain ranges in the western region that are a result of these geologic forces that have taken literally, millions and millions and millions of years. Both of these are still growing. So the Andes is larger, so the high peaks in the Andes are growing every year. The high peaks in North America are growing slightly every year. It's a little more stable. But this is also why the region is so prone to volcanoes and earthquakes and such like that, is these are incredibly volcanically active just because there's still this material, it doesn't stop when it hits, it just keeps on pushing. So it's sort of like a, was it an immovable object in the, irresistible force. So what you get is just basically these plates are still pushing into the slower pieces to the west. It's the same phenomena we saw here with the Himalayas here in India, with these Indian plate hammering into the Central Asian plate. It's the same phenomenon where the process is continuing. It doesn't stop when they bump into each other. It's not like an airbag deploys. The process keeps on happening. They keep on crushing into each other. They keep on stacking up. Same thing's happening here in the Americas. Now, this becomes the defining feature, and this is actually one reason why North America is significantly different in some ways from South America, although the process is the same, is the fact that in both these cases, you've got these massive, massive mountain ranges that literally go just, perfectly north and south. Again, very different than what you see almost anywhere else in the world. And so what happens is this has enormous climatic impacts because this shapes the climates both to the west side and the east side. The huge difference between North America and South America is in North America, you have the complexity of a second impact zone, if you would, further west, which would be the Cascades, Sierra Nevadas, and the Yukons up here. And then your Rockies to the east. So you've actually got this sort of pocket in between, and you've got a space here. And then your main mountain range here is in the sort of the middle western part. In South America, the main mountain range is right on the western edge. So you don't have this western sort of buffer zone or intermediate zone of things. So you literally in Peru, you go from sea level right into the Andes. In North America, you go from sea level to one mountain range and then down again then to another mountain range. So it's more balanced, maybe would be a phrase. Having said that, the mountain ranges work exactly the same because they end up as basically moisture capture zones. They end up because they capture moisture that blows in. So just like the Ko'olaus or the Waianaes do here, the rain comes in, hits the mountains, sheets down the mountains and turns into streams of water, etc. But with these regions, given the height of them, what you also have is enormous amounts of what we call snowpack. So what happens is when the water comes down from the clouds, from the atmosphere, it doesn't stay in liquid form. It either starts or it's converted into frozen form and it stays that way. Now this has the huge advantage as long as temperatures are fairly consistent in terms of going up in the summer and down in the winter, is you end up with enormous amounts of water stored, if you want to think of it that way, in your mountain ranges, which then as the temperature rises start to melt and sort of gradually release themselves downstream. Now we don't have this here in Hawaii, which is why when there's the heavy rain, it just comes honking down the streams because it basically all is liquid form from start to finish. But this is why if you live in the North Americas, we'll see later, in fact, if you start to watch those videos, or if you live in South America, there's enormous concern about how much snow falls in the winter, because that snow is actually a lot of what you're going to have as moisture coming down streams and rivers in the summer. And so the more snow that freezes up in the winter, the more water you're going to have in the drier part of the year. And the same in South America. Now, if you notice, it's very different than the monsoon. The monsoon is very much like Hawaii. It's all in rain form and pretty much stays in rain form. And so what you get is all you're going to get. So for North America and South America, the mountains are important, one, because they capture this snow, this ice, and then they release it in a fairly gradual way. And this provides the enormous riverine or river systems that we see throughout both of the Americas. The Amazon, the Mato and there are enormous river systems in South America. The Mississippi, Missouri, Tennessee, Columbia, et cetera, the different rivers that you see in North America are all fed or basically generated by virtue of this snow and this ice held in these high mountain ranges in the western part of the continents. And this gives them a very predictable pattern. Well, till our current global warming thing, where climates become very erratic, which is an enormous concern, not surprising in these regions. But what you had was basically very predictable water that occurred in very predictable ways. Now, in a very baby form, this is what you have in Europe. This is what the Alps do, for example, or the Pyrenees in the system between Spain and France, is they actually, again, is they take in water in its frozen form and then release it in the spring and summer, and that becomes the water that you find in the Rhine River or the Rhone or the Seine or whatever. So in small form, that's sort of this is the giant form of that same process. Or, as we saw in Asia with the Himalayas and the Ganges, or your Himalayan and other ranges here being the Yangtze and the Huanghe, for example, in China. So this capture system is hugely important. And because these are relatively new pieces of real estate, and because these peaks are growing, they're incredibly high. Some of the highest mountains in the world are in the North and South American mountain ranges. And this is where it becomes very different than what we saw first with Australia, and then of course we were just looking at with Africa. In both of those continents, they're very, very old pieces of real estate, and the mountain ranges have eroded to the point where they don't exist pretty much anymore. And so the end result of that is when potential moisture rain comes across these areas, it tends to drop pretty randomly because you don't have any mountain capture system. You have nothing that's going to convert that rain into snow and ice that then going to release it gradually during the warmer, drier part of the year. In Australia, that's why it looks like that. You don't have any mountain capture system. You have basically no snowpack. And so because you don't have any snowpack, it means you have no snow melt, which means you don't have consistent river systems. So that's one of the huge, sort of natural given gifts to the Americas, is the fact that you have these massive, massive mountain systems that cover enormous amounts of territory, which means if you think about it, they're capturing enormous amounts of snow and ice and then releasing that for the rest of the year. And that's absolutely central to what makes these areas, as complex as they are. Now, sort of the smaller player in all this, what would you see here when you look at the middle range here is one of the breaks or sort of offshoots. If you notice here, you've got the Atlantic plates. So here's the eastern half of the North American, South American plates. Here's the western edge. And if you look at here, what you've got is various cracks, or if you would, fragments between the two plates. This is where they actually split apart. And that's your island area, which we call the Caribbean. So the islands in the area between North and South America are basically remnant mountain ranges and all the other pieces of what was this mountain range here that have become sort of separated and sort of scattered as the plate material underneath is sort of buckled and moved here. And that's why you can see the sort of odd patterns here. And this is why this area is also very volcanically active, because it's basically got internal fracturing versus the western region here. You can see when you look at Mexico with the Rocky Mountains down in here, the Sierra Nevadas, which you called here. And then you got the Andes up here. You can see that this massive impact zone of this piece of rock and this piece of rock with these pieces of, basically under the water rock generate that. This area here, if you notice, is much more complex. And that's the Caribbean. The Caribbean is basically broken off fragments of, the larger American continents. The key difference with all those regions then, if you notice with this area, you have mountains, but you don't have the really high snowpack mountains in here. So what you basically got is the land bridge connection between the North American continent, the South American continent. That would be what's oftentimes called Central America, which I suppose, it's a very practical name, I guess, in some ways. Now, in the period of human habitation, which is a constantly ongoing argument how long people have been in the Americas, so now we're in the range of, anywhere from 30 to 80 to 100,000 years people were in the Americas. So it was one of the last areas that people moved into. So the human species, and that's generally because the general consensus is they had to come across when sea levels were lower. So if you look at here, for example, anything that's in light blue, that's generally about the 200-foot line. So when sea levels were lower, when more of the ice pack, for example, more water was held as ice in, say, the Arctic and the Antarctic regions, and even in the mountain ranges, and what happened is basically everything that's light blue was land. It was dry. So it's important to remember the sea level rise and sea level drop are not just found in periods of human use in anthropocentric Anthropocene. They're part of the cycle of nature on this planet. And so, in the last 15,000 years, for example, sea levels have risen and dropped just about, I think, 250 feet at various times. Most recently, the famous small ice age of about 800 AD. So if you look at this whole area, there are whole periods of time when basically you can literally walk from what's now Siberia and walk across to what's now Alaska, and you would never, you were never crossing water because it was part of the land bridge, oftentimes called the Bering Land Bridge, between these two areas. And this was also what this also meant is in that period is, of course, then Japan was attached to Asia, and then your Southeast Asian islands were attached to Asia. Australia never was. There's actually a break here because of the continental plates. So Australia was never attached to the Asian region. But the Americas, if you notice, what's interesting is even in the periods of sea level being lower, the area of the land bridge between North America and South America was never really much different than it is now. So this is an area that's actually got pretty seriously deep water on either side. So from getting from North America to South America was always going through a fairly constrained, narrow passage. But the other key factor with all this is, regardless of whether it was warmer or colder, sea level was higher or lower, is the central region here doesn't have the really high mountains. So not only does it have the snow capture, it also means like Asia and areas like that, it's much more vulnerable to basically weather patterns in this region. The rain you get in this area is the rain that comes down from the sky. You're not going to have snow melt releasing things slowly at other times of the year. So if there's no rain, you got a drought. If there's rain coming in, you're going to be swamped, which is very typical of this region. So the Caribbean is just somewhat different. It's in the tropical belt, and it's one of the few areas in the Americas that actually sort of mirrors, if you would, the same sort of scenario that you find for very similar regions, for example, in the coastal regions of Central Africa. So this equatorial belt has its own impacts, you might say, just by virtue of the large amounts of water, very seasonal. And again, there's no sort of, reserve system of frozen capture. It's, what you see is what you get. Now, from our standpoint, what's probably most surreal is human populations move into this area, we'll just say arbitrarily 60, 70,000 years ago, and pretty quickly, sort of amazingly quickly, humans just moved through the entire American region very, very quickly. We have some of the oldest sites in the Americas are actually found down here in the south, in the area of Terra del Fuego. It's not that that's the first place people went to. It's just that there's so little human impact in that area that really old sites survived just because no one's dug them up yet. So there were people, populating this place very, very quickly, and populations grew really rapidly. And so what you had was, by the time the Europeans finally, quote, discovered this part of the world, you have incredibly complex civilizations and cultures found all throughout the Americas. Some of the world's most complex systems, and largest, for example, the Incas here, and some of the earlier populations, political systems here in South America, were some of the largest in the world. And some of your population groups, for example, the Tolteca or Azteca or Mixteca Zapotecs that you find in this area of running, sort of this area of the Mexican, Guatemalan, et cetera region, they too are some of the most densely populated areas in the world. So very, very large, very organized, very structured civilizations. Where they differ from what we've seen before is they were never part of the communication process with Eurasia. So there might have been occasional, individual visits, a Japanese fisherman ending up, accident across the Pacific and ending up here in Mexico or something. But there was no cultural contact in the sense of persistent contact. There's no trade of information, no trade of materials, no trade of technology, for example, between the Americas and Eurasia. And this makes it very different, for example, even than Africa. Africa was always intimately tied into whatever the hell was going on in Eurasia. Either directly or indirectly, it was always part of the system. And if you think about it, the Eurasian thing oftentimes sees themselves founded by Egypt, for example. In the case of not so much Australia, though, a little bit. But again, this whole section here of Eurasia and this section was always tied to Europe by virtue of the Silk Road, trading systems, etc. So the huge thing is that makes this area different isn't so much the physical part. It's the fact that the Pacific Ocean on this side, the Atlantic Ocean on this side, basically acted as, if you would, gates and pretty much limited human contact between the area that was sort of developing as a package, at least, in some ways, and the area that was just entirely missing from that equation, which would be the Americas. This all changes radically when Columbus shows up in 1492 or whatever it is. I should note that, for example, Vikings actually were settling in areas in Newfoundland a lot earlier. But there's, again, almost no evidence that had any larger impact on the populations of North America, for example. So, you had people from Europe in North America. It just didn't change anything in North America. So again, it's not so much whether it was context, what the impacts of the context were. So the first massive impact is when Columbus arrives here. And again, you have to remember, given the fascination we were seeing earlier this semester, that Columbus didn't want the Americas to be here. This is like one of the speed bumps coming onto campus. Where he wanted to be was here. And, they'd misjudged the size of the planet. So he thought he was going to sail from Lisbon or someplace like that and basically come across and end up in China really quickly. And instead, whoomp, he runs into this whole new chunk of territory. And that, of course, turns out to be what eventually becomes very quickly the Spanish Empire. Now, where it becomes, from sort of an environmental standpoint, it becomes very surrealistic, is the Spanish first point of contact, and where their first really focus of contact is in the Caribbean. It's this particular area that Columbus first lands on. It's this particular area that the Spanish first interact in. It's this particular area that the Spanish start slaughtering the locals, turning them into slaves, et cetera, by 1510, 1520, such like that. Before they move in to deal with Mexico and other regions, they've completely focused their interest in the Caribbean. So the Caribbean, not so much because of the size, but because of, ironically, an accident of history, I mean, the fact that this is where the Europeans first based contact with the Americas becomes sort of the focal point of this. And to a certain extent, the history of the Americas is in large part sort of written by this contact in the Caribbean. Now, one of the absolutely surreal side effects is for most of the Caribbean, from Cuba on all the way down through to, say, Grenada, down in here. So this whole section, maybe 90% of what's called the Caribbean today, including Jamaica, for example, gets so modified by the Spanish and later the French and the British and the Dutch and everyone else coming in who still own property here. The Dutch still have islands here. The British still have islands here. The French still have islands here. The Spanish did till their empire collapses. So the Caribbean is a pastiche of European influence. It's sort of like a baby version of what you see in Africa. The side effect of this is by the time the Europeans are done changing this place or turning it into what they want it to be, they've done two massive things. One is they've entirely gotten rid of the indigenous populations. The two main populations, the two main culture groups that you find in this particular area were the Caribs, who I believe were in the Caribs were in the north and the Arawaks were in the south. By the time the 1600s have come about, between genocide and slavery and all the rest of it, those two populations are gone. The Carib Indians disappear completely. The Arawaks disappear completely, except for a small population somewhere here near Aruba. So, the two main groups, ironically, that Columbus bumped into, we don't know anything about them. Columbus and these other Spanish and other explorers didn't bother writing anything about the Indians. They just enslaved them. It's important to remember, for example, just as a side note, that African slavery is a result of the fact that the Europeans burned through Native American slaves so quickly that they need replacements, and they can't find replacements because they basically killed off so much of the population, especially in the Caribbean, that there's no slaves left to be had. There's no Indians to turn into slaves because you killed them all. So then you go and you ship in slaves from Africa to replace the dead Indian slaves. So African slavery was not the first slavery in the Americas. It was the replacement slavery in the Americas. And that's certainly true even in North America. Slaving by the British and the French was normal business practice right into the early 1700s. In fact, some of the Native American groups also got involved in slavery. So slavery in the Americas has a long history going back to initial contact. So not only do you get rid of the human populations that actually lived in these islands, you just erase them from history. You also so completely modify these islands that we really don't know what the ecosystems were in any of these islands anymore. They get so heavily modified by Europeans importing plants, animals, people from everywhere else in the world that, for example, in Jamaica, we don't know what 90% of the biota was at the time, Columbus or someone else first saw it. We don't know what the natural system was in Cuba, for example, at the time that the Spanish first, interacted with them. It's gone. It's been completely erased and replaced with other stuff from other parts of planet Earth. And that's more dramatic here than any place else on the planet. We just don't know. And it says something about the power and the impact that the Europeans had with a colonial presence, that you can basically erase entire environments, entire biosystem, entire social human system gets completely erased and replaced in a couple of hundred years in this area. So when you go to someplace like Cuba or Haiti or Dominican Republic or something like that, and you look around you, you're not looking at what the Arawaks or Caribs would have seen 400 or 500 years ago. They would have been in an entirely different world, of which it's impossible for us to even reconstruct now. So that says something about the huge impact that the Europeans have on this area. Now, the impact they have in the rest of the Americas is equally dramatic, but in some ways very, very different. We'll see that later. We'll look at a little bit more at the Caribbean.